side note about our first lesson today. A dresser of sycamore trees is who Amos was. That's the title of an excellent little book, A Dresser of Sycamores, by Garrison Keezer. Not Garrison Keeler, Garrison Keezer, Keisor. I believe that's it. Might be S-E-R. That's a book about a lay vicar living in Vermont, and I mention it because it's beautifully written, and I recommend it to you. Now let's talk about this morning's gospel. Jesus is having a conversation with someone we might call a lawyer, which means in this case someone who is an expert when it comes to Jewish law. In response to a question from Jesus, this lawyer correctly identifies the greatest commandment: love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. But then the lawyer asked Jesus a question: who is my neighbor? Jesus then tells the story of the Good Samaritan. This is a familiar story. We've heard it many times. But this morning I want us to look at three different perspectives. The perspective of the victim, the Samaritan, and the lawyer. Let's try to put ourselves in the place of the man lying alongside the road, almost dead, beaten and robbed. He had no cell phone. He couldn't call 911. And even if he did have a cell phone, there would be no ambulance rushing to save him. His only hope was that someone who happened to pass by would have mercy on him. He probably lost all that hope when the first two travelers, a priest and a Levite, people with some social stature in that world at that time, they walked on by. But then this Samaritan came along. We probably need to say a word about the Samaritans. They were the remnants of Israel's northern tribes who remained in northern Israel after most of the Israelites were exiled when Assyria conquered Israel in 722 BC. After most of the Israelites, except some of those in the north who stayed, after most of them had left, the Assyrian settlers moved in and occupied the land left by those who had been exiled. Now, those few Israelites remaining in the north ended up over time intermarrying with the Assyrians. So when the exile was over, the southern tribes, called the Kingdom of Judah, or what we would call today the Jews, did not want anything to do with the northern tribes because now they were impure. They had intermarried with the Assyrians, so they were a mixed race. Their Jewishness, in other words, had become diluted. After the Judean king, the southern tribes destroyed the Samaritan temple in 109 BC, the animosity between these two groups grew to a level of literally despising one another. Jews and Samaritans wanted nothing to do with each other. So returning to our victim, who was almost given up hope, should he have accepted the help of a despicable Samaritan? Or should have he sent that impure mixed breed on his way and waited for one of his own kind to pass by? There was a man who was in the middle of a very severe flood. The water crossed the threshold of his home. A guy came by in a jeep and said, "Get in the jeep and let's get out of here. There's a bad flood coming." But the man standing in the entrance to his house said, "No, it's okay. You don't need to save me. God's going to save me." Well, the flood continued, and now it was up to the man's knees. And a man in a boat came by and said, "Wait out here to my boat. Get in my boat and we'll get out of here. The flood's going to get worse." And the man in the house said, "No, go on your way. You don't have to save me. God's going to save me." The flood got worse, and now the man is on the roof of the house, and a helicopter comes by, drops down a line and shouts, "Grab the line and we'll pull you to safety." And the man said, No, never mind. You don't have to save me. God's going to save me." Well, the flood got worse, and the man drowned. He's standing before God now, And he said, God, I put my full trust in you to save me. Why didn't you save me? And God said, what do you mean? I sent you a jeep, a boat, and a helicopter. What do you want? For some people, it's difficult to accept help unless it comes in the way that we expect. But God's ways are not always our ways. God can use anyone, including the driver of a jeep, a boat, or the pilot of a helicopter. God can even use a Samaritan. When we are in need, may we remember to be open to God, who sometimes wears many different masks. Now let's consider this story from the viewpoint of the Samaritan. The Samaritan is traveling to Jerusalem. That means he's leaving Samaria, and he's entering into the southern kingdom, a place where he's not a very popular guy to begin with, because he's from Samaria. Now he knows there's bandits in the area because he has stumbled across this man who's been robbed and left for dead. And we are told that he has with him some beast of burden, probably a donkey, that he puts the wounded man on. And we also know he has a little money with him because he pays the innkeeper. So he must have realized that he was also a prime target for those same bandits. Yet he stops anyway, risking all that he has to save the life of a complete stranger. This is not simply an act of compassion. The Samaritan risked everything he had, even his own life, to save another. Would we be willing to take such a risk? Maybe some of you aren't aware of it, but this parish does take a very similar kind of risk. We have the building across the parking lot, which is now in renovations. I'll talk about the renovations later. We have something called the Good Samaritan House. It's been in place since at least Father Paul's time. That's a place where we take in homeless men. I'm not going to tell you some of the wild incidents that have happened in the Good Samaritan House over the last 6 years, because I want all of you to continue to support the Good Samaritan House. But let me just tell you, there's a lot of risk involved in what we do there. These men, some of them come to us directly from prison. Some of them come living in the woods. They're a rough group. The way our program works in the Good Samaritan House is we call it a working program. The idea is, in order to be admitted to the Good Sam House, you're interviewed by the Board of Advisors. The Board of Advisors are Andy Werkoven, Joe Letty, and myself. And if you're qualified, then you're admitted to the house. How are you qualified? You can have no kind of handicap. We call it a work program. You have to be employable from day one. In other words, anyone with a physical handicap, anyone with mental health issues that we're not prepared to deal with, anyone who is not in recovery from addiction to drugs and alcohol, they cannot be admitted. So the men are expected to be employed within 30 days. They can stay for 90 days. For the remainder of those 60 days after they're employed, we provide everything they need: shelter, food, clothing, so they can save all their paychecks. And after 60 days, leave here with a few $1,000s in their pocket, and they can get on with their lives. Simple program. The residents meet with me once a week for a house meeting, and I also counsel them on an individual basis. And we have great successes. The amazing thing to me is that we have to be very strict about the rules. If you drink alcohol, you have to get your stuff and leave immediately. Meaning that we have had to ask over the last 6 years at least 30 men to leave. Those confrontations can get a little iffy. I haven't been punched yet, but almost a couple of times. But my point is that I've never had to call the police. They've all left. I've had to threaten to call the police, but I've never had to do it yet. Even though they're being evicted, that gratitude of us trying to help them has allowed them to act like human beings and maybe not the wild animals that they were when they were first Sometimes, to be the hands of God in the world today, we have to be willing to take great risks. We have to step out in faith and give a hand up to complete strangers. And we do that in this parish. Now let's look at the story from the perspective of the lawyer. It is the most natural viewpoint for us to consider. Along with the lawyer, we are the intended audience of Jesus' story. No doubt the lawyer is a little bit shocked by the story. After all, the hero of the story is a Samaritan. I would imagine that at first he was offended to hear Jesus use someone from Samaria as an example of what it means to love your neighbor. Let me place that story in contemporary terms. When I took a parish in California, I've been there about 2 weeks, and I was at the grocery store, and I saw a man loading bread into the back of his pickup truck. Now, I've always been interested in food distribution programs, food pantries, food banks, those kind of things. So I thought, oh, he must be collecting this food for a food pantry. I need to go introduce myself so I can find out what is the local food pantry and get involved. So I went up to the man and said, where are you taking all this bread? Now keep in mind, I'm wearing black and a clerical collar and all that good stuff. This man turns to me and he said, do you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Lord and Savior? And I said to him, well, you know, as a matter of fact, I do. So he told me about the food program. But I was a little shocked. Did you see what happened there? According to that man, only certain people were allowed to be the hands of God in the world today. You had to believe like he believed, or you were disqualified from being able to act in the name of God in the world today. That's not the reality, though. It's not the reality in the Bible. Often God would use Assyrians, Babylonians, and people like that who had no belief in him to do his will. Sometimes when we as a church take on large projects intended to help the homeless, to feed the poor, to care for those who are sick or in prison, we have to partner with other groups in order to get the job done. Are we willing to work with other groups to accomplish common goals? I want to go back to the Good Samaritan house for a moment. For a number of reasons, we had to shut down the Good Samaritan house last November for renovations now. We have it taken apart. We have a contractor, Ash Aziz, not a member of this parish, but a man who said, I believe in what you're doing at the Good Samaritan house. I will do the work for free. I will also collect all the necessary building supplies that we need through donations. So I wrote him a donation letter. He shopped it around. And in that trailer that you see parked in the parking lot, we have 65 sheets of drywall, a new shower, a new toilet, new doors, new windows. We're getting all the supplies together. We have a couple of things that we need to get done that I'm probably going to have to get a grant for. We're working on that. We hope to have it open again in September. The people that are donating these supplies, and the contractor and his workers, they're not members of St. Stephen's. I don't know what their religious faith is, but they're willing to work with us to accomplish a common goal. What is that common goal? To fix the Good Samaritan house, the only men's shelter in Ocean County, so it will be in place and serving those men for the next 50 years. Who are our Samaritans? That's my question this morning. What groups would we be hesitant to partner with to accomplish common goals? Would we partner with the Assembly of God Church across the street? Yeah, probably we would. That's a pretty easy one. What about the Mormons? Will we partner with them? What about the Jewish synagogue? What would we join with the Buddhists to accomplish acts of compassion? What about the Muslims? What about the atheists? As long as we all stay in our own little groups, we will most likely not only have less of an impact on our communities, but most likely will simply continue to duplicate our efforts and so ineffectively use our resources in volunteer pools. Now, to be clear here, I'm not suggesting we compromise our beliefs. It is a good thing to make it clear that we are engaging in these acts of mercy as witnesses of the healing power of God's love made known to us through Jesus Christ. When people say, "Why do you have a food pantry?" I tell them because Jesus told us to feed the poor. Period. That is the primary reason why Christians serve the poor, serve food to the poor. What I'm suggesting is that God can use all kinds of people with different beliefs. Jews and Samaritans, Anglicans and Assembly of God, Christians and Buddhists, to accomplish God's purposes. Love God and love your neighbor. This is the great commandment. May we set aside our assumptions about how God wants us to express our love for our neighbor and then learn a lesson from the Good Samaritan and go and do likewise. Amen.
Amen.